Hello and welcome, Anthony Peake, and thank you very much for taking time to join us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me along. I'm really looking forward to our chat.
Now, today, Anthony, we're going to be discussing your new book, The Labyrinth of Time, and perhaps you could just set out, just briefly for the listeners, what it's about.
Okay, the time has long fascinated me, and The Labyrinth of Time is my fourth book, or technically my third or fourth, because I had two books coming out at virtually the same time in November of last year. But in my writing, I've been long intrigued by how human consciousness processes time, and how time is depicted in philosophy, within science, and even within culture across the ages. And this book is my attempt to do a really all singing, all dancing review of exactly what time is and how we perceive time to be. And I thoroughly enjoyed writing it because it gave me the opportunity to go into some of my favourite movies, some of my favourite poems, some of my favourite even musical pieces, to just convey the idea of exactly what time is and why it is so mysterious and so odd. I mean, I'm very much taken by the original famous quotation by St. Augustine when he was asked about time, and he reflected on it for a second, and he said, time is the kind of thing that if you don't think about it, you know you understand it. But as soon as you start to reflect on exactly what it really is, it becomes a total mystery. And I think that's what I'm trying to convey in this book, is just how time is all around us. It's something we exist within, and yet it is something that is a complete and utter logical, ontological, epistemological mystery, and it's just purely fascinating.
Yeah, well, it's probably something that a lot of people don't think about from day to day. They take it as a given, like many of the other aspects of the reality that we perceive and perceive to be real. But the fact that there is an issue there, I think, is probably, for most people's day-to-day experience, could be highlighted by the difference between experience time versus clock time. And most people will have had that sort of dissonance in their life. When you're having a good time, time seems to go quickly. When you're in the waiting room at the dentist, it seems to move very slowly. So that tells us straight away that there is something here.
Yes, this is an intriguing concept because philosophers for literally centuries have been fascinated by this differentiation between psychological time, i.e. the time that I feel inside my head, to external time. Now, a very famous French philosopher by the name of Henri Bergson very much defined these two things as being longue and durée. And in fact, interestingly enough, Henri Bergson heavily influenced a nephew of his who wrote a very, very famous novel about remembrance of times past, Marcel Proust. And again, this is to do with memory and time as well. So these things are linked in very much. But for me, the whole mystery is, if I have an internal clock and an internal clock time, how does that relate to external time? And indeed, is my time the same as the time you're perceiving? Because effectively, externally, we still measure time by the same external measuring devices, which will be a clock face or a digital clock or something like that. But effectively, if we use a normal clock face, what in fact the clock face is measuring, if we think about it for a second, is not time at all, but distance. Because what it's doing, it's measuring, say, for half a minute, what it's doing is it's measuring the time, in raised commas, it takes for the second hand to go halfway round a circle. But this, of course, is distance, which is a subtly different thing. Now, also the other intriguing thing about time is that it's the only thing I know that's measured by itself. You know, you can have a pound of apples, but you can only ever have a minute of a minute or an hour of an hour. You know, it's completely self-referential. And this is, again, where the mystery lies. You know, if I have an internal time scale, is it different to external time? And how can I ever know?
Well, quite. And such as man has been wrestling with this, that in your new book, The Labyrinth of Time, in the early stages, you point out that this is an ancient debate, and the philosophy of time, the discussions of it, they're trying to get to grips with what it is and what it means. It goes back almost to the dawn of man.
It does. It's something that time, as we were saying earlier, time is something that we exist within. And the question is, you go back to people like Marcus Aurelius and the original analogy of time being a river. But even if time is a river, what's doing the flowing? And indeed, again in the book, I think I mentioned the idea that we have this idea of time as a river. But in order to know that time is flowing, you need a river bank. In other words, if you're looking at a river and there are no river banks, you have no idea that the river is flowing or indeed in what direction it's flowing, because there is no referential point. So the idea is there must be a time by which we measure the movement of time. And interestingly enough, this was one of the major issues that stimulated an aeronautical engineer called J.W. Dunne to write a book called An Experiment with Time. And in this book, Dunne suggested that in fact there is another time which he called time 2. And we gauge the flow of time 1 against time 2. So time 2 is effectively the riverbank. But of course there then has to be something that gauges time 2 by, and then you get time 3, and you end up with an infinite regress. And as usual with all things to do with time, your brain starts to hurt. It's
Well, one idea that has been put forward more than once is trying to get away from the abstraction of it, almost to say, why do we need to try and define this, and rather just say that time is merely a lens through which we view existence and events, and of itself isn't really important.
Very true. There's a fascinating book written by a Oxford Don by the name of Julian Barber. And Julian is a theoretical physicist, and he's written a book called The End of Time. And what Julian suggests is, and this is something that is kind of new but not, is the idea that time in itself doesn't exist. Time does not flow. What flows is consciousness and the way we perceive time. So in other words, time consists of a series of slices, as it were, and each slice is in itself static. Now, this is something, again, that Hermann Minkowski, who was the teacher of Albert Einstein, decided upon as well, and they call this Minkowskian time. And it's the idea that time is like, I use the analogy in the book. It's like, imagine that you could take a time-lapse photograph of somebody's life. So in other words, when you take these time-lapse photographs of somebody moving their arm or walking across a room, and instead of seeing the person, you see a kind of a snake-like thing moving across the room. Now imagine somebody's whole life. You took a time-lapse photograph of somebody's whole life. So the critical fusion facility of the camera, or the shutter speed of the camera, was 70 years rather than 1/20th of a minute or 1/50th of a minute or whatever it is, or second, I should say. A human being would then actually be a very long snake-like creature that would sort of weave around the surface of the planet like a snake. And indeed, the Hindu philosophers have a term for this, and I think they call it the ling sarya, which is the long body. And it's the idea that this is all what we really are. In other words, at any time, at any moment in our life, we are literally just a snapshot, or a slice, like a slice and a sliced loaf of bread. This is the reality I am now. And the next bit of reality will be the next slice of the loaf as I move through it. Now, again, if any of your listeners are aware of the plays of J.B. Priestley, one of his plays, Time and the Conways, very much discusses this very idea. And again, it's vaguely related to J.W. Dunne and to people like Henri Bergson. And the idea that we perceive the moment, but the reality is external to us and eternal. So in other words, time, as somebody else once said, time is God's way of making sure that everything doesn't happen at once. And in many ways, these things are all very, very intriguing ideas. And again, I strongly suggest if anybody is interested in the whole scientific basis of these ideas, to very much read the Julian Barber book. Because again, if you look into quantum physics, the one thing that's intriguing about quantum physics is that at that level of reality, time flow doesn't exist. Time can flow backwards or forwards.